Today we have a very outstanding and excellent philosopher, Mr. Steven Friedman. And guys, you are so lucky to have him as a guest here, because this knowledge which you will know and learn during this conversation, you will never get it anywhere. So today, hopefully we will have these sessions regularly, and next week we also will have another interesting discussion. But before we dive into the discussion for today's topic, let me just briefly tell why are you so lucky, guys, to have Mr. Friedman here. So did you know that he was a very excellent and best student in his Harvard University, which he graduated successfully, and Mr. Friedman wrote a bunch of great works, as well as some works which very artistic ones. So he's an artist, and he was nominated and acclaimed by the New York Times as a genius philosopher. So thank you very much once again, Mr. Friedman, that you joined us today. And we know it's late there in the States, so, and it's still morning and very sunny. We can share a sun with you.
Yes, I am asleep. So I'm going to try to do this while I'm sleepwalking, if possible. No, but I think philosophy is done best late at night, when there's less distraction. One can sort of focus on issues more clearly. So for me, it's an advantage doing it at this time, as long as my energy sort of persists. So
yes, and as we have a very interesting topic today, nuclear, we are celebrating Nuclear Week here, Nuclear Awareness Week in American Corners, Kazakhstan, because in Kazakhstan it's also a very important topic. And so today you will talk about these nuclear issues from the perspective of philosophy. It's very interesting and exciting. So I'll give a floor to you to discuss it with our participants and visitors. So guys, if you have any questions, you can type it in the chat box, or unmute yourself and ask a question or say your mind. But please be respectful and don't interrupt if a speaker hasn't finished his speech yet. So thank you very much. The floor is yours, Mr. Friedman.
Thank you so much, Kimbet, for that very kind introduction. I want to thank the people at the American Consulate in Almaty. I'd like to thank Tracy and Omira and Consul General Eric Meyer for making this all possible. And yes, the expectation is that we'll be able to do this on a weekly basis. And so some of these issues that I'll be touching on today, it'll be possible to develop in greater detail in subsequent weeks. So this is an introduction to what will be possible. And one thing I should say, every time I have a talk to give or to prepare, I'll rehearse it, I'll practice, things to say, and every time I practice, it's a different talk. So until this proceeds, I really don't exactly know, the course it's going to take, the direction it will take, but I want to, yes, develop a philosophical perspective, on some of these issues, some of the most important issues of our time, of human history, in terms of nuclear capability, nuclear weapons, what they mean, what they signify, and something about their deep relation to philosophical considerations. So first, the nuclear age began July 16th, 1945, at about 5:29 in the morning in the New Mexico desert, an area of New Mexico, I think appropriately named the Journey of Death. The the head of the scientific head of the project to develop the atomic bomb was J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was a theoretical physicist, but also somebody, an unusual and complex personality. He had as much of a poetic dimension to his character and personality as he had a scientific one. In fact, it's sometimes been said that the reason that he didn't win a Nobel Prize was that he was somewhat constrained by the poetry of what he was doing, or what he saw himself potentially doing. When the Trinity test, it was called the Trinity test of the first atomic bomb, went off, Oppenheimer, who was about 5 miles away, said later that what went through his mind was a line from the Bhagavad-Gita, the Hindu Bhagavad-Gita, which translates as Song of God. It's a sacred text in Hindu culture. The line was, and the line is spoken in the poem, the Bhagavad-Gita, by Krishna, who is an incarnation, an avatar of Vishnu, a supreme deity. Basically, Krishna is an equivalent to the Christ of the Christian tradition, an incarnation of the highest deity. And Krishna is explaining himself to a warrior, Arjuna. And he explains, and the line that Oppenheimer quotes when the test is successful, which people were not sure it would be, was, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Well, that line is from a section in the Gita where Krishna is explaining, again, some of his characteristics as the supreme deity. And I think it's useful to hear the context, the greater context of that line. The lines that surround it are, and this again is God speaking to man in the Bhagavad-Gita. "Among rivers, I am the Ganges. Among purifiers, I am the wind. I am time without end, and I am death. I am death that seizes all, and the source of all that shall be born. I am beautiful speech, memory, steadfastness, and forgiveness, and the silence of things secret." Now, the point of that statement is that the Hindu deity, Vishnu, is identifying himself with the highest, the most extreme elements of human experience, or of experience generally. Among rivers, he's the Ganges, the greatest of rivers. Now, obviously, he's also has a relationship to all the other rivers in creation, but he is identifying himself most directly with the most extreme. Well, extremes play a decisive role in the history of human thought, in the history of human achievement. The religions, in general, are extreme responses to human experience and offer extreme solutions. The philosopher Kierkegaard once said that Christianity is a radical cure for our ills. And like all radical cures, one puts it off as long as possible. Well, like the religious traditions in general tend to respond to, for example, the world as profoundly unsatisfactory in some way that needs a powerful response, an extreme response. In the case of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, we fall from grace and need to be saved, need to be redeemed. In the case of the Buddhist tradition, life is dukkha, suffering awry, not right in any fundamental way. And we need to see through the problematic nature of the experience to a solution that is itself extreme. So we're dealing with extremities. Atomic weapons, nuclear power represents one of those extremities. Philosophy, represents another extremity. It's only these extremities that can really fully and ultimately satisfactorily answer the greatest of our needs. For example, Christianity worships a man being tortured. When Buddhists first encountered Christians, they were astonished. Why worship such a figure when the object is to end suffering, not seemingly embrace it in some way? Well, obviously the reason Christianity is focused on the cross is it represents the worst possible fate, torture to death. And that's what it has to be able to address. If Christianity could only address someone's headache and not something at the extreme of torture, then it would not be at the level of power and efficacy that religions aspire to be. Well, philosophy has a similar aspiration. Here's a brief story. I was going to be coming to Kazakhstan in April before the COVID pandemic prevented travel to give a series of talks. And in preparation for that, I went to a local college to talk to the philosophy department there and see about giving some kind of just practice talks, to some of their students. Well, the philosophy department was in a building of humanities and social sciences. And I went into the building and ran into one of the philosophers or one of the professors of philosophy. And I said to her, your philosophy department, is a small portion of this humanities social sciences building, which is somewhat inappropriate in the sense that philosophy is not a humanities, it's not a social science, it's not a physical science. And I went on to say, in fact, I haven't in my lifetime, even at Harvard, even in Harvard's philosophy department, met anyone, any professor of philosophy even, that I thought really had a deep and true sense of what the subject was, what it amounted to, and what its aspirations consisted of. And this professor, she wasn't repulsed by those comments. Instead, she said, well, what is philosophy then? And I said, it's simply the limit of rigor. It's a philosophical proposition is by its nature incontrovertible. If something is not incontrovertible, it's not a philosophical proposition. It doesn't rise to that level. Now, and notice we're dealing with something very extreme, the extremity of rigor. Now, what rigor is, obviously, is something that we have to address. I want to give you a little introduction to it. It's something that we'll talk about now. We'll talk about next week and maybe the following week, just because it's so central to what philosophy is, to its power, and to how it can address even more compellingly than the religious traditions, even more compellingly than science, the urgencies of the human condition, including those relating to nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs. Well, one thing that kind of helps illustrate this, I think, is that science, not a single scientific proposition rises to the level of rigor that philosophy demands and recognizes and embraces and uses in its activity to arrive at a solution to the human condition. And the simplest way to see that, there are a number of ways, and again, we can come about this from different directions, and that's a characteristic, by the way, too, of philosophy. And it's also a reason why every time I prepare a talk, it has a different character, because philosophy, a philosophical result can be approached from a lot of different directions. Well, the reason that a scientific proposition of any type doesn't rise to the level of rigor is that science ultimately demands the ability to perform controlled experiments. We hear a lot about controlled experiments these days because it's used in the attempt to develop a vaccine. It's used in the attempt to develop treatments for everything, including COVID-19. Well, to do a controlled experiment, you need two things. You need two things that are identical. One thing gets a drug, the other thing gets a placebo, a sugar pill, and you compare the results and you see if the thing that's gotten the drug does better, lives longer, gets better faster, whatever you're trying to investigate, than what gets the placebo, the inactive drug. Well, one of the reasons why a controlled experiment in this world is theoretically impossible is one of the most obvious facts about our situation that's almost never appreciated. And that is, look around, what's the most obvious thing you see about what you see? And I will tell you, the most obvious thing about our circumstance, the world is different in different directions. There's a fundamental asymmetry to our world. And because of that, whatever is positioned here is in a different environment, a different ground than what's positioned here. And that difference alone is enough to undercut the rigor of any conclusion you draw from your experiment. It turns out, and again, we'll talk about this more in other contexts and from other directions, but it turns out that the inability to perform theoretically a controlled experiment goes even deeper than that. It turns out that even if the world was perfectly symmetrical, even if there was nothing in the world except 2 points that you were comparing or assessing, it wouldn't be theoretically impossible at the highest level of rigor to do a controlled experiment and get a rigorous result simply because 1 point is to the left of the other. That whatever allows you to distinguish a control group from an experimental group is what's called the confounding variable that makes it impossible to draw a rigorous conclusion. Now, here's how this applies to daily life, and then I'll kind of segue into some of the philosophy of the nuclear issue. A common religious proposition that is going to relate to some of the things we'll be talking about very soon is this notion of judging others, whether one can legitimately judge or assess someone's sort of motivations, actions, decisions. And again, in Christianity, there's the injunction, thou shalt do not judge, that God can judge, not human beings. But that's a religious injunction, that you cannot judge because God forbids it. Philosophy achieves the same result by a consideration of the rigor or lack of that situation. So for example, we often hear, in order to be able to have a comment about somebody, to have an opinion about their behavior, to judge them in some way, you have to be in their shoes. You hear that a lot. You must walk in someone's shoes to know their situation, understand their circumstances, and appreciate what's motivating their behavior, their actions, their decisions. From the standpoint of rigor, that's not enough. It's not enough to be in their shoes because you're going to be approximately experiencing what they know. From the standpoint of eliminating rigor, what philosophy demands, you need to know exactly, precisely, where nothing can be left out. So you think to yourself, well, what if I were in their skin? Better, but still, you would have to be in their skin from the moment of their birth. In fact, you would have to be in their skin from the moment of their birth and never have entered your skin at all to be legitimately in a position to evaluate them. Because otherwise, there will be at least one difference, one thing about their situation that you will not be able to glean. And that's enough to undercut the rigor, the strength, the incontestability of any claim you might be inclined to make. Okay? So philosophically, because of the demand for rigor, you cannot judge. And if you are judging somebody, it's because you're approximating to their situation. Approximating to someone's situation is useful when we're doing all kinds of things, when we're doing science, approximations, when we're modeling things, when we're predicting weather patterns. All of these approximations are helpful, they are useful. They help us create various technologies. They do not create salvations. They do not solve the world because they are short of the rigor that such a solution demands. And one further gloss on that notion of rigor. There's famous 20th century philosopher, Wittgenstein, a German philosopher who did most of his work in England, but he only wrote in German because you can't do philosophy actually in an acquired language. So even though he was good at languages, he only wrote in German. Well, Wittgenstein, who is, in my estimation, the great philosopher of the 20th century, maybe the greatest philosopher in the Western tradition since Kant. Before Kant, Aristotle. Wittgenstein liked to begin his works with a quotation. Quotation from literature. Wittgenstein was fairly well read. His magnum opus, the book that established him as the great 20th century philosopher from our perspective now, is a work that was actually published posthumously after his death. It's called The Philosophical Investigations. He began that work with a quotation by an Austrian playwright, Nestroy. And the quotation is, "It is in the nature of every advance that it appears much greater than it actually is." Well, that's a statement of humility, right? That's comparable to Newton's sort of famous proclamation. "If I have seen further than others, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants." That type of claim. And it's nice as a statement, again, of a kind of a somewhat unassuming, somewhat humble attitude. But it wasn't the quotation that Wittgenstein had considered going with initially. The initial quotation was something from Shakespeare, from King Lear, which many people consider to be Shakespeare's greatest literary effort. The quotation is a line from King Lear, an aging king, to King Lear from a counselor of his, a counselor named Kent. Kent says to Lear, "I'll teach you differences." It turns out that rigor is of difference, and any difference that pertains between two situations, two individuals, two circumstances is sufficient to undercut the rigor of whatever result you want to try to get to. Okay, so rigor is of difference, and it's going to be central, again, to the philosophical enterprise. So we're using a high standard, an extreme standard of assessment and judgment, where a controlled experiment is not rigorous. Science is not rigorous. The claims of religion turn out to be more metaphorical than rigorous in the philosophical sense. So again, we're dealing with something that is as extreme as a nuclear weapon. Now, I want to kind of segue, as I said, into the issues of nuclear energy. First of all, I want to tell you an anecdote. When I was at, in the first week when you go to Harvard, Harvard's not open this year because of COVID, the students are not being permitted on campus, but prior to this year, the first week of orientation to new students consisted partly of the opportunity to meet with some of Harvard's most celebrated professors. And you would meet with these professors in small groups of 5 or 7 or 10 students, and an eminent professor. One of the professors that I met with my first week in college was Edwin Reischauer. Edwin Reischauer was ambassador to Japan during the 1960s. He was an expert on Japan. In fact, in the 70s, a Japan Institute was established at Harvard, I think partly motivated by his work and in honor, of his efforts and of his contributions. It's present, as part of the university today. Reischauer, during World War II, was one of the principal experts on Japan that was advising US military intelligence during the war. And near the end of the war, he was one of a small group of people that was selected to advise President Truman on the use of the atomic bomb, on whether, once the bomb was successfully tested on that early morning of July 16th, how it should be deployed, what should be done with it. Most of the scientists that were associated with the development of the bomb, including Oppenheimer, once they saw the effects of that initial test, they thought there's no way that this weapon could or should ever be used, certainly not used against a population. Well, Reischauer detailed what the considerations were that led to the actual use of that bomb. Turns out, the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The considerations were, first of all, they had no confidence that these weapons were going to work. Even after that first successful test in the desert, that was a test where one of the devices was on a platform. It wasn't dropped from a plane. These were complicated devices. And in fact, one of the interesting things about the development of the bomb that pertains even to this day is developing the bomb. It was not a difficult question of physics. The actual physics of the bomb, and we will talk about that in a second because I want to get to the work of Einstein, and that's how we're going to get to the philosophy of all of this. But the actual physics of the bomb is relatively simple once Einstein had done his work and arrived at that famous equation, E = mc². The difficulty of achieving the bomb was the engineering of it, how to actually make a device that could work. And it turns out that there were like a few dozen scientists effectively working on the physics of the bomb, and there were 100,000 people around the country sort of involved in the engineering. That was a difficult task. Even after the war, the Soviet Union developed their atomic bomb about 4 years after the end of the war. The Soviet Union had spies in Los Alamos in New Mexico where the bomb was being developed. So they knew about the development, and they had one of their spies, a Fuchs, his last name was Fuchs, had like a photographic memory. And so he was able to sort of look at sort of blueprints of what was being done, remember it, and transmit that information to the Soviets. And the Soviets were America's allies during the war, so whether or not that was fully understood at that time, it wasn't as if the Japanese or the Germans, were actually spying effectively. Well, even though the Soviets had the blueprints, and even though the device had been successfully tested and deployed, it still took them 4 years. It took them twice as long to develop the bomb that it took the United States because of how difficult an engineering task it is. So, okay, but so they didn't know if it was going to work. They had only 2 bombs left. There was a third bomb after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs that was ready for assembly by the end of August. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were dropped on August 6th and August 9th. So several weeks later, there would have been a third bomb. That was it. That's all the United States had. So on the one hand, they didn't know it was going to work. And they were afraid that if they arranged a demonstration of the bomb and it didn't work, the war would not come to a swift end no matter what. That would undermine the credibility of the United States. And they thought there was a very strong chance it wouldn't work at all, even though the test initially had been successful. They didn't know if a second test would be successful. The other issue, of course, was that they only had 2 bombs. If they test one of them, they only have 1 left. And then there was this consideration that during World War II, it was really the first war that had seen a lot of aerial warfare and aerial bombing. And people thought, Germany thought, that they could defeat England by bombing sufficiently. Well, the United States and the Allies powers thought that they could successfully, possibly defeat Germany by bombing sufficiently. After the United States and the Allies in the Pacific retook enough of the Pacific islands from the Japanese that they were close enough to the Japanese mainland, the United States began bombing Japanese cities prior to the use of the atomic bombs. Prior to the dropping of the atomic bombs, the United States had effectively destroyed 67 cities in Japan. And by relatively conventional bombing, lots of planes dropping lots of bombs that would set cities on fire. That did not achieve an end to the war. So conventional bombing, people realized, wasn't strong enough a weapon of destruction. It would destroy a lot, but it wouldn't destroy the spirit of the people, to continue fighting. That all changed with the atomic bomb. One of the main interests in the actual use of the bomb on those 2 cities, aside from the fact that they weren't sure in advance whether it would work at all, and they only had 2 bombs, to use, was the horror of that device. The idea that a single such bomb could produce that magnitude of destruction, that magnitude of horror. And that was what ultimately was successful in terms of its impact. And when, after the Japanese surrender, Japanese prisoners of war returned to Japan through, various countries like, in China, or where they had been captured. And all of them were returned to Japan through the port of Hiroshima, which was now a desolate wasteland of atomic destruction because, again, of the horror of it. Even after those 2, the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki bombs were dropped, the horror was such that most people, and again, we have not used atomic bombs in war since. the horror of those devices is such that prior to that point, prior to that sort of moment of capitulation of Japan at the end of the war, Japan was really largely a samurai culture, a warrior culture. You know, they were, as the fighting was progressing, you know, during the Second World War in the South Pacific, and the Japanese were depleted of resources, you know, were losing, you know, the war. They knew they could not win. They were not fighting at some point to win. They were fighting to save face. But the horror of the nuclear bomb was such that effectively it transformed Japanese culture. It transformed the sort of spirit of the society. It almost eviscerated that warrior spirit and transformed Japan into what we see now, a culture that's, well, obsessed with gadgets, cell phones, you know, electronic devices, cuteness. You know, there's a culture of cuteness there. So it completely changed the temper, the tone, the spirit of the culture. That's the horror, you know, of those devices. And it's, and let me make a political point about this too. The nuclear weapons, ever since they were initially launched, you know, were seen as devices that could only unimaginably be used. Okay, and they haven't. I mean, we've tested devices, yes, and it's been estimated that about 2,000 nuclear tests have been done since, you know, the end of the war, but we haven't had a nuclear conflict. We haven't had a conflict on the scale of a world war, like World War I or World War II, which were only separated by 20 years. Even though we've had all kinds of, you know, smaller kinds of scale conflicts, we haven't had that level of conflagration for 75 years now. Well, in modern times, like post-Renaissance times, the longest period that Europe went without a major conflict, a kind of a large multinational conflict, was the 100 years between the end of Napoleon in 1815, the defeat of Napoleon, and the beginning of World War I in 1914. That 100-year period was able to preserve the peace through a series of international treaties, organizations, commitments that were carefully engineered, and in terms of preventing the kind of large-scale conflict, successful for that century. Eventually, of course, those alliances helped variously precipitate what became World War I. So after 100 years of that kind of stability, that peace broke down. And we got World War I, and then we got World War II. Now, nuclear weapons effectively have, in the thinking of a lot of people, preserved the peace for 75 years. Whether they will continue to do so or not, obviously, no one can say, right? The problem with getting rid of nuclear weapons, obviously, is the power that they give a possessor of such weapons. I mean, we see that with North Korea. North Korea, having achieved nuclear capability, is in a different position now in the nations among the nations of the world than it had been. So, of course, Einstein was once asked what he thought World War III would be fought with. And he said, I don't know what World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Because whatever World War III is fought with, it will effectively obliterate civilization. So we know that nuclear weapons have that potential. But in terms of the political considerations to completely denuclearize, that would take us potentially back to a situation prior to 1945 when we did see international conflicts on a regular basis. So it's a problematic political issue, a problematic political question. But did you want to ask me something, Kimba?
Mr. Friedman, yes. So thank you so much, very much for this speech. I would just propose, like, if we can leave some minutes for questions and answers, because we have in the chat box several questions from our participants.
Oh, okay. Okay. So
yes, maybe they want to just learn from you, like to learn the answers from you.
Okay. Okay. Should I?
Okay, or we can ask our participants to unmute themselves and just ask. Maksud, your question was first. Could you please unmute yourself and ask? Or I can read instead of him.
Maybe you could read it, or am I able to read it or not?
I can read it aloud, so
okay.
People also can hear.
Okay.
Mr. Friedman, you're yes. What do you think about? No, it's not here. What was the purpose the nuclear energy was created?
The purpose for it? Okay.
Yeah, for what purpose?
Okay. First of all, when the nuclear energy in general, the possibility of nuclear energy goes back to Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. And with the basis for nuclear energy is that if you have a certain amount of mass, like a kilogram of anything, let's say a handful of salt, and you multiply, let's say, that kilogram by the c is the speed of light. The speed of light is an enormous number. It's 300 billion meters per second. You take that number, you multiply it by itself, then you multiply it by the 1 kilogram of mass in your hand, and that's the amount of energy that's released by that handful of salt. So it's an unimaginable amount of energy. It's so basically, whatever you see that's in the form of a physical object can, in principle, be converted to energy. If you converted the energy of your own body, the mass of your body into energy, that there would be enough energy there to destroy the Earth. I mean, that's how much. So the possibility of nuclear energy became viable because of that equation. Now, it was not clear to Einstein what the application of that equation would be. Einstein did not anticipate the ability of human beings to engineer bombs. He did not think that he did not know of a chain reaction, the kind of physics behind what turned out to be the basis of the bomb. So he wasn't aware of that. The potential, obviously, for nuclear energy is it is the most potent source of energy that we know of. It is the energy, basically, that drives the sun. So if we want unlimited sources of energy, the closest we can come to that is the ability to convert mass into energy, and that is through a nuclear process. Is that so? So ultimately, the reason that the nuclear energy was first used in the development of a bomb was because usually war, which is a matter of life and death, where issues are so urgent, so pressing, motivates technology. So throughout history, a lot of major innovations, developments have come in warfare because you're struggling to survive. Well, when it was discovered that we could take a small amount of mass and realistically convert it into energy, the first application since the discovery happened, at the start of World War II was, we need to use this to make a bomb. That simply, if the physics sort of surrounding the bomb were developed completely independently of a war, of World War II, then we might have seen the development of nuclear energy for nuclear reactors to power cities, not bombs. But because of the confluence of factors, because of when these discoveries were made, because of the nature of and the bomb was not developed to be used against Japan. The bomb was developed to be used against Germany, against Hitler. And the fear was, and the reason for the urgency of the project was that there were physicists in Germany that were making the initial discoveries that made a bomb ultimately possible. And that was happening like in 1938, right before the actual outbreak of fighting. So the urgency, in fact, Einstein signed a letter that was written by another physicist to President Roosevelt when this other physicist, his name was Leo Szilard, made Einstein aware of these experiments taking place in Germany in like 1938, 1939. They brought Roosevelt a letter saying, this is what the possibility is based on these experiments in Germany. And we think that the destructive power might be so great that we better undertake a project to develop a bomb before Germany does. Because if Germany develops that bomb first, they'll have the most powerful weapon in history and they will use it. So the motivation for the development of bombs was because of the urgency of the war at the time and the fact that if it wasn't for the fact that Hitler was so anti-Semitic that all of his Jewish scientists left Germany, like in 1933 to come to the United States would not have had the intellectual power to develop the bomb. In fact, up until 1933, Germany had produced the majority of Nobel Prize winners in physics, in chemistry. Since 1933, the United States has produced the majority, and it's mainly because of all the physicists that left Germany and came here. That included Einstein and Edward Teller, who developed the hydrogen bomb, and Enrico Fermi from Italy, because his wife was Jewish. The major physicists who were responsible for that development all came from Europe. They fled Europe. And if they hadn't, if Hitler had had a different sort of program of conquest, the world would be a very different place. Yes. But yes, okay, no, there's still some, I didn't get to my major points, but that's okay, right? We should take more questions, right?
Go on, please.
Yeah, okay.
I think, yeah.
Okay, here's what, I want to switch quickly to get to something that I'd like to talk, we'll have to talk more about it, but just so I can introduce it so you can see the depth of this. Okay. So Einstein didn't know that E equals mc squared, which was what he was most proud of, and is probably the single most important result in the history of physics, that equation, okay? Einstein thought so too, and there are reasons for it, but he didn't know that that could lead to a bomb. He didn't know that there would be actual practical applications of it. He really didn't. But the interesting question is where that equation came from. Like, what was the ultimate source of that? And that's something that I find not even physicists appreciate. Not even Richard Feynman, the great Nobel Prize winning physicist who was on the Manhattan Project, appreciates exactly where Einstein was getting his ideas and his motivation. And that's because American physicists are not philosophers. American physicists have no background in philosophy. Einstein saw himself as much a philosopher as a physicist. Heisenberg, the creator of quantum mechanics, was doing as much philosophy in creating quantum mechanics as he was doing physics. That was the advantage that European physicists had. They came from a philosophical tradition. Well, it turns out that that equation, and we're not going to do the math, Don't worry about that. We're not going to develop the math of it. But the idea is important. The idea is critical. And it's amazing. That equation, E equals mc squared, comes from Einstein's theory of relativity. Okay, that famous theory of relativity. Okay, that theory of relativity, which is one of the most important results of modern physics, modern thought, is based on two propositions. One, and it's kind of reasoned from these propositions. One is that the speed of light is a constant, a universal constant, that wherever you are in the universe, the speed of light is always traveling at that 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, that 300 billion meters per second speed, always. That was, now Einstein felt that that was true based on some experiments that had been done, okay? He didn't know it was true, it's just a postulate, something that's assumed for his work, okay? That's not the important position, the important starting point. The important starting point was the other principle, and that is what gives the theory of relativity its name. It's called the principle of relativity. And that is that it is, Einstein assumed it was theoretically impossible to do an experiment that could show that you were in motion versus being at rest. In other words, it was impossible to prove that any given object was in motion relative to the universe. So in other words, like, I'm gonna, there's, what, God, I'm gonna give you, can I give you an example? I'm gonna give you, it's okay. So what Einstein was doing to come up with that principle is the same thing that Heisenberg was doing that became the basis of quantum mechanics. What they were both doing was basically the physics of existentialism. Existentialism is a branch of philosophy that, again, I have not met a philosopher who understands, who's able to explain what it is. And I just read a book on Kierkegaard, who's seen as the originator of existentialism, a book that came out, like, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, where the author of the book is not able to explain what existentialism is clearly, even though she's writing about the first main existentialist. The point of existentialism is that it is impossible, that we imagine that it is possible to view the world from outside the world. That is not a possibility. But our notion of reality is of the world seen from the outside. We imagine, and to see how, when Einstein says that, the point of Einstein's theory is that where you are is, and where I am, and where any given individual is in fact the still center of existence. That's the point of Einstein's theory. In other words, when you, and let's say you don't agree to that. Let's say you feel that, no, I can't be the center. How would you know that? The only way you could possibly know that would be if you could remove yourself from the world and look at it, or look at your shadow in the world and see how, in other words, see the world as if you were seeing it from the perspective of God. Our sense of reality is of the world seen from the outside. The reason we have that sense of reality is it's an artifact of language. Language exists as, language does not exist to facilitate communication between people. That is wrong. If we did not have language, we would have no thoughts to communicate. Okay? It's language that enables the thinking process in the first instance. We have language to facilitate not communication, but coordination. Language is what makes possible coordinated action between human beings to advance social ends, because human beings are more successful at surviving in a social network than they are one-on-one, face-to-face with nature, or one-on-one, face-to-face with a lion or a tiger or a chimpanzee, all of which are more powerful. We are effective and powerful as when we can engage socially and achieve group results. Language facilitates those group results, but in facilitating those group results, it also achieves the perspective of our seeing the world as from the perspective of other people. We imagine we can put ourselves in the position of other people. We imagine we can remove ourselves from the world and put ourselves in the world here or here or here or here. That is the fundamental illusion. In fact, and I can develop this more, like next time, but it turns out that the ultimate source of human suffering can be traced to just that circumstance, the belief that we can leave the world to see the world, or that we can view the world from the outside. And it turns out that one of the solutions to our circumstance, our problem of human suffering, is what I mentioned earlier, that the world is different in different directions. So like those two sort of propositions that you wouldn't think have power turn out to, well, the fact of the matter is that so I just want to say that E equals mc squared comes from Einstein's sort of working from the notion that you cannot see the world from the outside. The world has to be described from where you are. And from where you are, you cannot know that you are moving unless you are outside yourself. You can't do that. So, yes, and it's, but, and let me just make one more comment about that. Throughout most of European history, people, until the scientific revolution, people believed in what's called the Earth-centered universe, right? People imagined that the Earth was at the center of the universe and everything was moving around it. And the main evidence for that is you don't feel you're moving. You see other things moving, but you don't feel that you're moving. You don't feel that you're moving around the sun. It looks like the sun is moving around you. Well, when Galileo and Kepler and Newton, developed modern physics, that first synthesis of modern physics, like in the 17th century, suddenly the Earth was seen as moving around the sun. So the question became, we're moving because the physics tells us we are, but we don't feel that we are. Why don't we feel that we are if we actually are moving it you can calculate that if the Earth is rotating on its axis at the equator, you're spinning at 67,000 miles an hour, okay? I'm sorry, you're spinning, no, not quite that fast, but you're moving around the sun 67,000 miles an hour. So the speeds that we are supposed to be moving through the universe at are astronomical speeds. We don't feel that we're moving. Well, the answer given to that was the principle of inertia. And the principle of inertia just says, it's not, it simply says, you don't feel that you're moving because you don't feel that you're moving. In other words, it's not an answer. But it was an answer that was maintained from the time of Galileo and Descartes and Newton up until Einstein. And Einstein solved the problem of why it is, if you're on a spinning Earth that's revolving around a sun at 67,000 miles an hour, and the sun is moving in its star system, and everything is moving at these colossal speeds, why don't you feel it? And the answer that the theory of relativity gives, that Einstein gives, that is ultimately the source of E equals mc squared and the atomic bomb, all of that is, the reason you don't feel that you're moving, you're not moving, period. To know that you're moving, to say that you're moving is to is an abstraction, something that you can never validate. And it turns out that the whole power of the theory of relativity and the whole power of modern physics, again, quantum mechanics and relativity, probably the greatest intellectual achievements in the history of the human race, all of that results from the development of the idea, the implications of the idea that you cannot leave the world to view it. So that's where E equals mc squared ultimately comes from. So, and that circumstance is on the order of a religious sort of response, in the sense that there is a famous Hindu lullaby that Hindus tell their children at night. It goes, "Child, you are yourself when you sleep and when you dream, and even when you are awake. Look at the world going by." That's Einstein. That's the theory of relativity. That's the nature of our circumstance, that the world has to be solved right here, right now, independent of all future experience from right where you are. And the only thing that can achieve that solution is the limit of rigor. And that's what Einstein was not quite operating at that limit, because he was developing science. So we've already seen that science isn't fully rigorous. It's less than that. But philosophy does aspire to that level of rigor. And that's why philosophy, and we can develop this more, is able to achieve rigorously what the religions imagine metaphorically, intuitively. But philosophy gets there rigorously. And part of that rigor is the work of Einstein, based on effectively the physics of existentialism, of not being able to leave the world to view it from the outside. And that is what ultimately led to E equals mc squared. So it turns out that as horrific as nuclear weapons are, as horrific as the consequences of E equals mc squared are, the source of that is linked, ultimately, we'll see, to the solution to the world. I know that's a lot to sort of take in, but that gives you sort of a little bit of a picture. But however complicated some of this might sound, it's not complicated. It's only complicated when you first hear it, and it's only complicated because it has to explain everything, which means that we would have to talk about everything to see how everything kind of fits together, and how this kind of does account for like a whole series of aspects of our experience and our issues and our circumstances. But yeah, I just wanted to say that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. And just our brains are boiling, but it's very interesting. Yeah,
it's interesting. And so see, it's something that you will not encounter in a physicist will not be able to explain that, because the physicist will not. There's a famous photograph of Einstein's desk the day he died, and the desk, it was a large desk, and it was filled with papers and books and papers, right? And you can read some of the things that were on his desk, on his table, right? But there's only one word that you can clearly read, and that was the word philosophy. And it was like some book or journal or something that he was reading. That's the one word that you can see on his desk the day he died. So he was committed to the physics of philosophy, because the physics of philosophy is the physics of a rigorous response, or a more rigorous response. Again, science doesn't quite rise to the highest level of rigor. That's why science doesn't solve the world. That's why science doesn't make us feel better. Philosophy can, because if science stops here, philosophy pushes the limit to its end. Whatever the limit of rigor is, that's where philosophy is. That's it. So even if we had a disagreement as to what a rigorous proposition was, it doesn't matter. All that matters is what we finally, in the end, can find incontrovertible. That turns out to be decisive. And for the theory of relativity, what's incontrovertible is you can't know that you're at rest versus being at motion relative to the universe, because you can't see the world from the outside ever.
Mr. Friedman, but by the way, there is a question from Katerina. She's asking, like, is rigor a clarity, or could you please explain this term again?
Okay, yes, rigor, basically, rigor is not so much clarity. No, it's more a question of something that you cannot dispute, cannot counter in some way. So, for example, to give you an example, here are some examples of rigorous propositions. The past cannot guarantee the future. In other words, no matter what you think, no matter what past experiences you've had, since the future hasn't happened yet, it can take, so far as we know, any possible form. The past can't guarantee that the future will take any particular path. And then another rigorous proposition is the future decides the past. In other words, what happens next decides your sense of what came before. In that, like I sometimes tell people, like one of the main philosophical questions is this world real or is it a dream? Is this just a dream? Okay? And I tell people, if one day we awaken to a totally different reality, where that persists, and this reality, whatever this was, is no longer present, then from that new persisting reality, we'll look back on this and say, this was a dream. But reality, as I sometimes say, is a term of comparison. But the fact of the matter is, or another rigorous proposition, 2 is not 1. It doesn't matter what 2 means or what 1 means. All that matters is if you have one thing here and one thing there and they're different, then that difference is an incontrovertible claim. And in fact, rigor is mostly the recognition of differences that undercut your ability to make some of the claims you think you can make. In fact, one of the whole Western philosophical tradition originally really starts with Socrates. And the Socratic contribution to the world is this notion, and my sort of statement of it would be, we suffer, not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. So just as like the rigor of Einstein's work, for example, was in establishing that we are not in a position to know that we are in motion relative to the world, or that we are in motion relative to existence per se. That so far as we can ever say we are where, and all of the equations of relativity, all of the math of relativity is developed so that we can assert with confidence that where we are is the still center of the world. So in other words, the reason that we don't feel that we're moving is we're not. Yes, it's exciting. Because there's a beauty to it, and there's a dignity to it. We're talking about the absolute dignity of each individual, because wherever each individual is, so far as we can ever say, that is the center of existence. Wherever you are is the place to be. Seriously. I mean, you can compare yourself to others. That's entertainment. It's not rigor. And again, it's like the best way to see what the power of rigor is that any difference between me and you, any difference, means that whatever applies to you need not rigorously apply to me. In other words, I may die, okay? But the fact that you're where you are, I am where I am, means that just because every other human being has died does not mean that you will die. And the simple reason is that there's, from a standpoint of rigor, because there's at least one difference between you and everybody else. You're in a different position. And maybe where you are is the point of immortality. That's the point is we can't make the claim. Like when we say philosophically, all men are mortal, where do you get that idea? You can't know that. You can believe that, but how do you know that for sure? See what I mean? Philosophy is interested in eliminating everything you cannot know for absolute certainty. It's a very high standard. It's the highest possible standard. And it's taken a long time to get to that standard. It's taken the work of people like Einstein and the work of lots of mathematicians to push, and the work of lots of philosophers to kind of push the standards or the level of rigor to the point where it's so elevated that it's now powerful enough to address our fundamental needs, as it was doing with the work of Einstein and Heisenberg. I mean, their physics is more powerful because it's a little bit more rigorous, a little bit more.
But is there anything certainly rigorous in the world, or we also do not know?
Oh, again, it's more in terms of that again, past can't guarantee future. I mean, there's no rigorous claim about things outside of yourself, but the most important aspect of it is to undercut things that we think we know, or that we think are true, but that don't rise to that level. And so, yeah, it turns out, yes, that ultimately that space, we can call it a rigorous space, that space of philosophy, it's an aconceptual space. It's kind of equivalent, it turns out, to, it's the logical form of the space that religions have imagined when they've talked about things like mystical union with God, or nirvana, or enlightenment, or salvation. It's the equivalent of that, where, when people talk about the silence of God, for example, or that a state of the solution to things is a state of silence, it's because it's aconceptual. Our concepts are approximations. In general, our concepts don't fully rise in most instances to enable rigorous claims about the world. But again, it's much more important to understand what you are saying. And well, here's a good way to think about it. There's a Buddhist saying, don't seek reality, seek to put an end to opinion. Rigor, the exercise of rigor, is designed to put an end, to show what's an opinion and put an end to it. And then what's left over after all of the opinions have been silenced because they're just opinions, that's a rigorous space. So it's something that involves an exercise. It's an active process to get there. But I can show you more about how to do that. I mean, basically, if you look around and you see objects, you're not seeing a rigorous space. So in other words, if you look around, you're seeing objects. You are seeing we might want to talk about this more next time, because it's a whole big topic, because it relates to something I do want to talk about, and it's something called convergence theory. And it's one aspect of my philosophical work that shows us how to deal with things that are not rigorous, and how to come up with solutions to to problems that are raised in those areas. And that applies to most of human considerations. So basically, convergence theory and what's not rigorous helps us survive. It helps us develop technologies. Rigor achieves what religions have seen as salvation. It achieves a complete solution right here, right now, where you don't need anything beyond your current circumstance.
Yeah, let's leave this for the further
We should leave
discussion.
that, yes.
It's a very, very great topic. But we have still an unanswered question from Varghese, and it will be the final one, so we will not take your time any longer.
Okay.
Varghese is interested, Mr. Friedman, do you think that only nuclear destruction has caused Japanese technological development?
Do I think that the nuclear destruction has like motivated Japanese technology?
Yeah. Like, I think he's wondering whether it is the only reason that
no, I don't think, but I think it is I think the trauma of those bombings was such, I mean, even today, if you visit Hiroshima, which I haven't, but I hope to, if you dig down beneath the surface of Hiroshima, about 2 or 3 feet, you'll find a thin layer of white ash. And that thin layer of white is basically the bones of the victims of the bombing. Basically, Hiroshima today is a cemetery. The entire city is on the foundation of the lives that were incinerated, in that bombing. So I think, no, but I think that, I mean, I think there are a lot of factors, and that's something we can talk about next time too, the notion of there being like lots of factors that contribute to any sort of object in the real world. Like it's like every object is a convergence, and Japanese technology represents a convergence of a lot of elements that have come together. But one of those elements was the psychological implications of World War II, the devastation of World War II, but especially the horror of those 2 bombs that fundamentally, I think, altered the attitude, the outlook. I think again, that's the only country that suffered that fate, right? That's the only country that lives with that reality, that they experienced those events. I think that still is present, in their consciousness, and I think that has helped redirect their energies. Yes. It's not the only factor. There's never, and about that, and this is something I do want to talk about next time too. The idea is for any question like that, the question of like, what factors might have been responsible, there's no way to answer those questions, because there's no way in principle to do the controlled experiment that would allow you to answer those questions. So aside from the fact that controlled experiments are theoretically impossible, if they were theoretically impossible, we'd have to kind of go back in time and manipulate events. In other words, it's at best going to be pure speculation on our part. We're not going to be able to achieve a rigorous result. We're only going to be able to achieve what I'm going to be calling a heuristic result. A heuristic result is a result that aims for a particular goal, and that can be achieved by basically adding elements together to achieve that goal. But in terms of exactly what elements, will be necessary to achieve a given goal, you can't know in advance, because every experience is slightly different. And so rigorously, any difference is decisive. Any difference means that you can't make an incontestable claim. You can only make a guess, just a guess. And the point of the guess is in terms of various goals or strategies that we might have. It's ultimately to achieve certain ends that help us survive in some way or enjoy life in some. I mean, it has very specific kinds of goals that that it's trying to achieve. The point of salvation, right, what religions call salvation, is the goal has been achieved. There's no place you need to get to beyond where you are right here, right now. That encapsulates the solution. That's, again, I'm just, but notice how that, the notion of an extreme limit of rigor, which again, I'm not saying it's something that we're all familiar with. I mean, it's something that, I need to talk about more, but it has the power of a religious type of force without being religious, by being something grounded in logic, if you like, an incontrovertible logic. There are issues with logic, as we'll see, but again, we want to develop it more. And remember, I said at the beginning that every time I prepare a talk, it always takes a different form. I can't ever go into a talk knowing what I'm going to say in advance, because there are always different ways and different avenues to take. So the same thing here. It's like I find that the best way to understand this is to see it from different directions. See how it applies to different aspects of human experience, and see how it helps. But what some of the things I'm saying does in fact help do is to clarify a lot about our circumstances. So and what I'll explain, like, I guess in the future, is that the fundamental question to ask about any issue that we're confronting is it capable of rigorous assessment or evaluation or not? And if it is, then it has a certain status and a certain form. And if it's not, then there's another approach to achieving or working within that area, that avenue. But we'll have to talk more, right?
Yes, definitely. These questions, like, they need a lot more time. Unfortunately, we lack of time, like, we are limited, and we really don't want to make you stay awake at that late time.
Okay, I understand. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I understand. Okay, but
really,
I mean, I think with Tracy and Amir, we were agreeing that I would just do this every week. So I'm prepared to do it every week.
That was a wonderful speech. Like, me personally, I would listen to you forever. It was very interesting, and I hope, like, our participants learned also a lot. And we wish that other guys will join us next time. And you are always welcome, all the participants who are joining us today. So next week we will see each other again, and please, like, feel free to ask questions, and maybe you can think about today's topic and today's philosophical ideas, and
yes,
like, digest it, and then ask Mr. Friedman next time.
Yes, I can clarify things I said today if people like to. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
So, thank you very much, Mr. Friedman. We wish you a very pleasant night. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you a lot.
It's sunny. I'm jealous. Here it's dark and gloomy, but it'll be bright, right, in the morning.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Well, have a great day yourself, and it was a pleasure. I enjoyed this. It really was.
Thank you very much, as well as we do. Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Goodbye. See you next time,
Okay.
everybody.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.